Welcome to today's Explainer. If you're a focused learner gearing up for the MCAT, well, you've landed in exactly the right place. Today, we're tackling an absolutely massive, high-yield topic, the foundational structure of the human immune system. We're going to break down this complex source material so you can build a really strong conceptual framework for test day. We'll be covering the whole shebang, from the rapid-fire innate response and those highly targeted adaptive defenses, all the way down to the lymphatic network that makes the entire operation possible. Let's get into it.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. 1. The daily siege. 2. Innate immunity. 3. The big split. 4. Inflammation. 5. B cells and T cells. And finally, 6. The lymphatic system.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the daily siege of microscopic threats. Let's be real for a second. Every single day, your body is basically a microscopic war zone. You are constantly exposed to an absolute barrage of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites. But it's not just outside invaders. Your immune system is also constantly on the lookout for internal threats. Think abnormal, cancerous cells, or any other foreign material. Yet, despite this unending 24/7 siege, you aren't constantly sick, right? That's because our immune system is remarkably, incredibly efficient at containing and eliminating these threats before they ever truly take hold.
Moving right along to Section 2, innate immunity, and why we need a mental image first. The source text gives us this brilliant piece of MCAT strategy. It says, focus on the big picture first, creating a mental image to help you put these concepts together, then go back and plug in the details. So let's build that mental image right now by looking at your body's foundational physical and chemical barriers. Before immune cells even get involved, a pathogen literally has to bypass your skin, navigate sticky mucous membranes, dodge sweeping respiratory cilia, and somehow survive the highly acidic environment of your stomach. This first physical line of defense is incredibly effective at keeping threats entirely outside the body.
That brings us to Section 3, the big split between innate and adaptive immunity.
So, let's say a pathogen actually manages to breach those physical walls. At that point, the mammalian immune system relies on two distinct divisions. First, we have innate immunity. Think of this as your rapid response team. It's always active and super fast, but it's entirely non-specific. It doesn't really care what type of pathogen is invading, it just knows it doesn't belong. Then, on the flip side, we have adaptive immunity. Now, this system is a bit slower to act initially, but it targets specific pathogens and, crucially, creates immunological memory. This adaptive side further splits into humoral immunity, which is driven by B cells in your body's fluids, and cell-mediated immunity, which is driven by T cells.
Now, digging a bit deeper into the actual cells driving these responses, the MCAT heavily tests the distinction between granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes include your neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. These are cells quite literally packed with toxic granules ready to be dropped on invaders. Agranulocytes, on the other hand, lack these prominent granules. This group includes lymphocytes, which are the main all-stars of the adaptive system, and monocytes, which act primarily over in the innate system. Let's move to Section 4. Inflammation, your internal first line of defense. When that rapid innate system kicks in, it uses a perfectly coordinated sequence we all know as inflammation. Here's how it flows. Following a tissue injury, inflammatory chemicals are immediately released. This causes vasodilation, which just means your blood vessels widen, and it increases capillary permeability, making them leaky. This rush of blood flow is exactly what causes those classic signs of redness and heat, while the fluid leaking into your tissues causes the swelling. At the exact same time, a process called chemotaxis chemically attracts a fresh squad of immune cells straight from the bloodstream to the injury site to handle the infection. Who's calling the shots during all this? Well, two crucial chemical messengers drive this process. Basophils and mast cells release histamine, which is the primary driver of all that vasodilation and leakiness we just talked about. Meanwhile, macrophages and dendritic cells are releasing cytokines. Think of cytokines as the project managers. They coordinate the overall immune response. You might also experience a fever during this time. Now, a fever isn't just a random symptom, it's a deliberate, systemic response designed to create a hostile, overheated environment that slows down pathogen growth and actually enhances your own immune activity. Let's categorize some highly tested innate cells you absolutely need to know. First up are phagocytes. These are the eaters. Neutrophils rapidly devour bacteria. Monocytes circulate in the blood, but once they enter tissues, they mature into massive, hungry macrophages. Dendritic cells are a bit different. They capture antigens specifically to present them to the adaptive system.
Then we have our specialists. Natural killer cells are super important because they actually hunt down and destroy our own infected or abnormal cells, like cancer cells. And eosinophils, they're your primary defense against parasites and are heavily involved when you have an allergic reaction.
All right, Section 5, B cells, T cells, and targeted defense.
So, when the innate system is overwhelmed and needs backup, we turn to the adaptive system. This whole division relies on recognizing specific antigens. The absolute stars of humoral immunity are your B cells, which develop and mature in the bone marrow. When a B cell gets activated, it secretes antibodies. An antibody is essentially a Y-shaped protein made up of 2 heavy chains and 2 light chains. The variable region, up at the tips of the Y, is what binds to a highly specific antigen. The constant stem at the bottom determines the antibody's class. For the MCAT, you gotta remember these 4. IgG is the most abundant and can actually cross the placenta. IgA is found in secretions like your saliva and breast milk. IgM is the big first responder. And IgE is heavily tied to allergies and defending against parasites.
Over on the cell-mediated side of things, the response is driven by T cells. Now, these originate in the bone marrow, but they travel to the thymus to mature. The MCAT loves, and I mean loves, to test the distinction between the 2 main types of T cells. First, CD4 helper T cells. These recognize antigens presented on MHC2 complexes. Now, MHC2 is only found on professional antigen-presenting cells like macrophages, and it strictly displays extracellular antigens. On the flip side, we have CD8 cytotoxic T cells. These recognize antigens on MHC1 complexes. MHC1 is found on almost all nucleated cells in your body and displays intracellular antigens. This allows the CD8 cell to spot a virally infected cell and destroy it right then and there through apoptosis.
Okay, perk up your ears because this brings us to a massively common MCAT trap. Because CD8 T cells destroy cells presenting abnormal antigens, students often mistakenly assume that any cell showing an antigen is going to get killed. But remember what we just said? A macrophage displaying an antigen on an MHC2 complex is a professional messenger. It's just communicating with CD4 helper T cells to activate the rest of the immune system. That macrophage is simply sounding the alarm. It is not signaling for its own destruction. Keep that straight, and you'll save yourself some easy points.
Let's wrap up with Section 6, the lymphatic system.
Actually, right before we trace the lymphatic network, we need to look at how adaptive memory functions. Your primary immune response happens upon your very first exposure to a pathogen. It's relatively slow, it takes time to build up an antibody count, and it relies initially on IgM. However, this whole process leaves behind memory B and T cells. If that exact same pathogen ever returns, bam, the secondary response kicks in. Because of those memory cells, this repeat response is overwhelmingly faster, much stronger, and heavily dominated by IgG antibodies. This brilliant mechanism of immunological memory is exactly how vaccines work to protect us.
But here is the grand finale. None of these highly targeted attacks, none of these memory cell deployments, absolutely none of it could happen without the lymphatic system. This incredible network of vessels constantly collects excess interstitial fluid from your tissues and channels it through your lymph nodes. These nodes act as tiny security checkpoints packed with immune cells, actively filtering for pathogens. In this broader system, the spleen filters the blood, the thymus matures T cells, and the bone marrow pumps out all these vital cells. Eventually, all this filtered fluid, now called lymph, is returned safely to your venous blood circulation. It's the literal highway that makes every single immune response we've discussed today possible. But it does leave you wondering, if our most powerful defense mechanisms are this complex and destructive, what happens when that perfectly balanced system suddenly misfires and turns against us? Definitely something to chew on as you continue your MCAT prep. Thanks for joining me on today's Explainer.